Hello everyone, Alec Eldridge, the Side Quest Gamer here. The S stands for Side Quest Gamer, not Superman. I don't know what you were thinking. Anyways, happy Halloween, and well, I'm going to review a 6-level short NES game that can probably be beaten in over an hour depending on your skill set. Now, it's no secret I hate Konami as a publisher and refuse to review any more of their games because of how they treated not only the people who work on their games, but also how they treat the customers now that Castlevania has reduced to a bunch of fetish pachinko machines out in Japan. So, Americans don't get to experience this, not that they would want to, but it just goes to show how big of a hole that Konami has dug themselves into. But knowing this is on the Nintendo eShop for like $5 if I'm not mistaken, it's not really going to bring them out of the hole they dug themselves into. So, I'm going to fulfill this long request I got like a while back, even a few years ago. So, this is Castlevania for the NES. Is it as good as everyone says it is? Well, let's find out. Happy belated Halloween. I know I'm a procrastinator and it's November, but better late than never. Castlevania is that NES game, the one legendary NES game that is always brought up when you talk about your favorite NES games, or if you're trying to get into the NES library of games, someone will likely mention,
"You should play Castlevania, it's so good."
I either see the first one or the third one in everyone's top 10 favorite NES games list, and I can't blame them. It's so unlike anything else at the time, nor was there anything released like it afterwards. For one, the game has a spooky aesthetic, yet has a fast-paced atmosphere rather than a subtle, creepy one because, well, it's an NES game. You really can't make something scary with the limitations of the sound chips back then. Known as Akumajo Dracula, or Dracula's Satanic Castle in Japan, it was originally released for the Famicom Disk System in 1986, but due to its success in Japan, it was finally brought over to North America in 1987 in hopes it'll meet similar success. Although, in North America, its title was instead Castlevania. Ha! I see what they did there. It's an amalgamation of Castle and Transylvania. Not really. It's really not that funny, but I doubt that evangelical Christian parents would buy their kids Dracula's Satanic Castle for their impressionable youngsters, so I'm fine with whatever they call it. Now, keep in mind that's just a loose English translation of the Japanese name. Some say it's Dracula's Satanic Castle or Demon Castle of Dracula. Either way, it would raise some eyebrows if it were named that in the localization over here. Yet, when you fight all the enemies like fish monsters, zombies, mummies, Medusa heads, heck, even death itself, then it does make a lot more sense as the title gives some context as to why a fictional character like Dracula, known in the books to be a solitary creature living in his own castle, all of a sudden has a massive army of demons at his disposal. But regardless, Castlevania is legendary among the NES community, and I like to challenge the status quo by asking, does it deserve all the praise it gets? Well, does it? Oh, wait, I have to answer that for myself. The game starts off with a long-haired man opening a gate to Dracula's castle. This is Simon Belmont, the vampire hunter. He was tasked by his village to end Dracula's terror, and that's all there really is to the story. Not the most complex story, but it gets the job done in revealing the reason as to why Simon is here in the first place, massacring demons and such. The game itself doesn't explain this, but the manual does explain you have to destroy the curse of the evil count, and that everyone is home at this castle. It's supposed to get you unsettled, but the game itself would immediately just get you in the mood to destroy enemies with your trustworthy whip. Not a sword, not a silver bullet, a whip. Interesting choice of weaponry, but this isn't just any whip, it's an upgradable whip where it'll get more powerful as you destroy the candles containing either hard secondary power-ups, but the ones you really want are the whip upgrades. The second whip is more powerful but has a short range like your normal whip, but the third whip is the most powerful and has a longer reach. You do lose your whip upgrades and sub-weapons when you die in addition to one of your lives, but it usually doesn't take long to have a level 3 whip once again. The first level is your standard how the game is played level. It's not really a tutorial level, but the enemy count and variety is much lower, and the level itself is pretty short, and could be beaten in just a few minutes. Here you will learn to jump, hit enemies, climb stairs, and fight a boss, which in this level is a giant bat that is pretty easy. The second level kind of emphasizes using a secondary item you're holding, which could be an axe, knife, or even holy water. Holy water is your saving grace, as it'll make short work of the enemies in this game, especially if you stayed alive long enough to collect a double or triple shot. You know, the Roman numeral items you get from candles, which will make that item even more powerful than it already is. Level 2 does introduce the dreaded Medusa heads, and I died more than I would like to admit due to not learning their spawning and moving behaviors already, but once I did, they were never really a problem until level 5 where you're in the room containing the Axe Knights and Medusa heads. That was pretty hectic. Now for the level 2 boss, you do fight a giant Medusa head who is pretty easy, especially with the holy water that keeps the enemy at place while dealing heavy damage. So now you know everything you need to know about Castlevania from those first 2 levels alone. But as for the rest of the 4 levels, well, you know when there's a BS moment or an exploitation that the player can either get frustrated or take advantage of, and that you just think, there's no way the designers had that in mind when developing this game. There are a few moments like that in Castlevania. The difficulty of the game stems from whether you just go to the end regardless of the consequences, or do you carefully strategize, like keeping a secondary weapon at all times and not collecting any other in order to get past the tricky section. Because by the time you get to the 4th world, the obstacles can get really frustrating if you go about it normally with just the whip upgrades and never use a secondary weapon. But if you find and keep a holy water and stay alive to fight a boss at the end, you can even make short work of them in no time. But the question is, did the designers account for the player to exploit the holy water in this manner? Sure, while the consequence is that it uses the heart currency you collect, which powers all your secondary items, there are a lot of 5-point hearts throughout the level where if you stay alive until the end, you can just spam holy water and still have more than half the energy left if you defeat the boss. But be sure to keep your health bar high enough by stocking up on some wall chicken you would find in breakable walls. Although, who in Dracula's castle thought it was a great idea to hide a nicely prepared chicken inside a breakable wall where it'll probably be filled with rubble and cobwebs? Maybe they like it that way? I don't know. It's probably one of Dracula's minions who was sick of having his lunch stolen in the break room. The bosses are not well designed because they can either be really easy or really hard depending on the mindset. The first 3 can be taken out easily with a whip, while the 4th boss just requires you to hit the Frankenstein over and over, but use the whip to keep the menacing Igor at bay, because that thing is a pain in the rear. The 5th boss, as well as the 2-phase final boss, is either a war of attrition with just the whip and secondary items that are not holy water, while total pushovers with holy water. There's really nothing to them. And yes, while there is truth to the statement that it's a 1986 game and the boss battle standards weren't to their peak, I still think it's fair to acknowledge how far that the series has come since Castlevania 3, Super Castlevania 4, and all the sequels afterwards have done boss battles much better than the first game. I suppose you can't really expect much, as Simon Belmont controls very stiffly. His jump trajectory is stiff, while his whip can only go in one direction, making flying enemies that can move diagonally kind of a pain to deal with. And this game can be really punishing thanks to the infamous knockback where if you get hit, you'll fly in the air and 75% of the time you'll land in a bottomless pit if you're not careful. I get it's to portray realism, like if you take a punch to the face, you're probably gonna fall backwards. However, knockback in this game is insane. You shouldn't be flying in the air like you're the antagonist of a Popeye cartoon. But seriously, it's just like a Mortal Kombat fatality whenever Simon dies from knockback.
Fatality.
So, is it the great NES game everyone makes it out to be? Well, even though I don't have the highest opinion of it, I think in some degree it is. I would honestly much rather play a Mega Man game on the NES, well, except for the first one. I am personally not a fan of the knockback, and the fact that Simon can only whip in the direction he's facing, I do think the game would have been much better if he could aim upwards at the flying enemies, and I don't think it's too much to ask. It'll still be a challenge, but at least you'll have a chance. I do like the graphics, as for a bleak setting like Dracula's castle, there's a variety of colors that makes the game very lively. And the music is very fast-paced and fun to listen to, although there's not a lot of melodic variety as each theme kind of sounds very similar to one another. Even with the lack of variety, I do think what we have is satisfactory enough. Regardless of the opinion I do have of it, I can't deny that Castlevania is a very unique game, and I do respect it for starting something really great. And with this game being included on the NES Mini, I bet this game will have a lot more fans. But overall, I think Castlevania for the NES is decent for the most part. Nothing more, nothing less. I mean, it's not a long game as it can be beaten under an hour if you're that skilled. Regardless, happy belated Halloween, and remember to stay scary. And yes, I'm still running with that joke, don't judge me.